Welcome to Inside the Birds Fantasy Football Show with Andrew DiCecco. I am Jeff Mosher, and with me is Andrew DiCecco, a staff writer from InsideTheBirds.com, and also our fantasy football expert. Andrew, it's week 5, and if a lot of owners are like me, they start to question things. Guys playing well, guys not playing well. You'll have the bye weeks coming up, and you're looking at your roster and you're wondering if you can make a move or not. It's a time that people can panic. So I want to start off by asking you about a specific fantasy player that may not be performing to standard right now, but you believe will pick it up and be that guy.
Yeah, Jeff, there's a lot of players like that. And I'm in the similar situation. In one of my leagues, I drafted Kyle Pitts in the 4th round. And of course, I haven't gotten that sort of output that you expected when he was drafted. He was supposed to be that unicorn type player that you were going to see play all over the formations. And right now that hasn't really transpired. However, last week he did generate 9 targets, only caught 4 passes for 50 yards. Next week they play the Jets, and then they have a bye week. But the next part of the schedule is very favorable. I would hang on to him. I think that it's a matter of time before he gets that continuity with Matt Ryan. And if you really look at it, Calvin Ridley didn't do a whole lot either. He had 13 targets and only mustered 80 yards. So it's not just Kyle Pitts. I think it's a product of the whole offense. And I think it's only a matter of time before you get those 2 guys involved. Another player I want to look at is Damian Harris, the running back for the New England Patriots. 10 carries, 10 yards the past 2 weeks.
Not good.
Not really a factor in the passing game. And Brandon Bolden had 6 receptions last week. So I think he's going to really factor into that James White role while he's on the mend. So those are some players that I would really look at. Also, Rondale Moore, the wide receiver for the Arizona Cardinals, really burst onto the scene in week 2 with 114 yards and a touchdown. Then he sort of faded in the background behind AJ Green rather, and Christian Kirk, and only mustered 5 catches for 29 yards on 5 targets for the past 2 weeks. So, I mean, if you're thinking like I'm thinking, I put him on the waiver wire this week. I can't really depend on him. The offense is way too volatile to depend on a player like him, although he does have upside. He's also AJ Green doubled his snap share this week, and he's still behind Christian Kirk as well. And the last player on that list is Brandon Nyuk. I think everyone should be ready to move on from Brandon Nyuk at this point. I held on to him longer than I probably should have. He has not eclipsed 37 yards receiving this year, despite that breakout rookie campaign, despite playing 67% of the snaps, which was second most behind Deebo Samuel for the wide receivers. He's only had 3 targets last week, mustered 15 yards on 1 reception. Is not a guy you can count on in your lineup. He's a big boomer bust candidate, and I think right now there are much better options out there. So those are some players that I'd be looking at to move on from.
How about any players who are playing really well that you doubt can sustain that level of play? Is there anyone people should maybe want to sell high right now?
Cordero Patterson, I would say, is a player that I would look to sell high on right now because I don't know. He's not a running back. He's someone who's catching lightning in a bottle, in my opinion. He sustained it for a number of weeks, but is that going to be able to carry over for an entire season? I don't think that that's going to be the case. That's not really what he's equipped to do. So I think that when you look at teams that are, David Montgomery's hurt. There's a lot of running backs that are banged up right now. And I think that he's a viable trade option if you're looking to bolster other areas of your roster.
Yeah, the Cordero Patterson breakout has been maybe one of the more unexpected breakouts of the year. But to your point, I know he had a big game this past week, but he still only played 30% of the team's offensive snaps. So maybe a good, as you're saying, maybe not sustainable from a point standpoint, and a good player to sell high right now. All right, let's look at the matchups for the weekend as far as some good waiver claims. Who are you seeing out on the waiver wire that you would jump on?
Trey Lance. Trey Lance is a player that I drafted and held on to as a potential lottery ticket. And now he's got a couple weeks here to really put his stamp on that position. Jimmy Garoppolo, of course, has been the veteran guy that they've moved forward with, but hasn't really moved the needle one way or the other. He's been a steady presence there, but Trey Lance brings that dual threat ability, and I think that he could really maximize some of those weapons. You talk about Deebo Samuel, he's having a career season. There's other weapons there in George Kittle and Brandon Nyuk, and they're running the ball with Trey Sermon, who had 19 carries, big week for him. So they have a lot of weapons, and I think they're really going to be able to be maximized under Trey Lance, but you need to if you're in a position where you can't really wait, in the case of many Brandon Ayuk owners, you don't really have that luxury of waiting for him. But I think that better days are ahead for this Niners offense, and it's exciting to see what he's able to provide. The next player I would look at is Damian Williams. David Montgomery is going to be out for an extended period of time with a knee injury, and Damian Williams had 50 of his 70 yards in his absence in the fourth quarter. He has not really performed too well this season with his opportunities, but I think that he has a good matchup this week to take advantage of. So I'd look to grab him and plug him in the interim while David Montgomery's out. Also, I think it's time we start looking at Dalton Schultz and talking about him as a viable tight end option for teams that are trying to put it into their streaming. 13 targets, or I believe he had 15 targets, caught 13 balls for 138 yards and 3 touchdowns over the past 2 weeks. That's someone that you need to have in your lineups. Dawson Knox is another player that I would look at in that regard, the tight end for the Buffalo Bills.
By the way, your point on Trey Lance, according to Yahoo, still available in 71% of the league. So I'm sorry, 61%. So not too many people have him on their teams yet. So it's a good time to go get him.
And there's another player that I would like to add into this is Jameson Crowder, the slot receiver for the Jets.
Good one.
He's someone that's accumulated 211 targets over the past 2 seasons, missed the first 3 weeks with a groin injury, took over for Elijah Moore, who was out with a concussion, and he amassed 7 receptions for 61 yards and a touchdown. He's a target monster, not really a red zone guy, but if you listened to me last week and picked up Hunter Renfrow, he's in that similar mold along with a Cole Beasley. So he's someone that can get you some easy points.
Absolutely. I meant to hat tip you. I know a couple of weeks ago you had the Cordero Patterson get, and then last week, good call on Hunter Renfrow. Let's look at some start 'em sit 'em matchups for week 5. Who do you like to start and who do you like to sit?
I think you have to look at Sam Darnold as a start this week. I mean, Sam Darnold's thrown for 300 yards over the past 3 weeks. He's also ran for 4 touchdowns over the past 2 weeks. And you might see him even get in on the rushing action against that vulnerable Eagles front. You have to like what Matt Rule's done with Sam Darnold. He looks like he's really in his comfort zone there. They have a number of weapons that I think they're going to be able to exploit the Eagles back end in that regard. So he's someone that you can safely put in there. And I think he's still going to eclipse that 300-yard mark, and he has a solid floor. James Robinson's a player who I mentioned last week, Jeff. He had 78 yards and 2 touchdowns on Thursday Night Football, coming off 10 days rest, playing a Titans defense who ranks 13th among fantasy running backs. But James Robinson is going to get the lion's share of the carries because if you look at last week, I thought it was notable that Carlos Hyde was inactive. Mm-hmm. So that's a player that I would look at moving forward as someone who's going to get that volume that we were accustomed to seeing last season. So I'd plug him in. Also, Mike Williams, the wide receiver for the Chargers. He was on a tear coming into week 4. He had 4 receiving touchdowns. He had 4 targets, 1 reception for 11 yards the other night. But I do think that he's going to get back on track against a leaky Browns secondary. So he's someone that I would look at as a play. Sure. Turning the page on the other side and looking at the sit-ems, Latavius Murray. Latavius Murray is someone that everyone may rush to the waiver wire to pick up, but you have to look at the situation that he's in. They got Tyson Williams. They have Le'Veon Bell. You have Latavius Murray. Now, Le'Veon Bell only had 4 carries last week, and Latavius Murray had 18 for 59 and a touchdown. But they're playing a fairly stout Colts defense, and I don't know that you can really rely on Latavius Murray as being a every week starter. I think he's a good flex option. And you sort of want to see how that backfield shakes out because it seems very volatile week to week. Chris Carson, the running back for the Seattle Seahawks, missed Tuesday's practice with a neck injury. So I think that's something to monitor throughout the week. He's also facing a very tough Rams defense. So that if you have other options, I would look to make sure that you have those ready and be able to put in your lineups because that's a tricky situation there. And that's something that I'd be avoiding. Also, Kenny Gallaudet, I'd like to end it with Kenny Gallaudet from the Giants. Kenny Gallaudet has been very pedestrian throughout the first few weeks of the season, had 116 yards last week. But outside of that, he's been relatively, he's just been a guy and not as advertised. And this week he gets Trayvon Diggs and the Dallas Cowboys. I think that game can get out of hand pretty early. So that's a player that I would be looking to fade this week.
Awesome. To your point on Sam Darnold, he so far has outscored Russell Wilson, Dak Prescott, Lamar Jackson, and Aaron Rodgers. I'm not sure a lot of people would have thought that was going to happen, going into this year. So obviously a good play right now going up this Sunday against the Eagles defense that has been an absolute sieve for both quarterbacks and running backs the last 2 weeks. All right, that's Andrew DiCecco. He's got all the fantasy football matchups, information, waiver claims. You just heard him. We do this every week. Thanks to Andrew. So for Andrew DiCecco, I'm Jeff Mosher. You've been watching Inside the Birds Fantasy Football Show with Andrew DiCecco.